Let me start again. Hi, my name is Tan See Seng. I'm Professor of International Relations at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So thanks for having me. Indeed. My personal opinion is that the TPP should continue. It has to continue because you may recall that before the TPP, there was something called the P4 that was initiated by countries like Chile and Brunei and New Zealand and my own home country of Singapore, whose aim was to spur trans-Pacific trade in the light of the difficulties that the WTO was having, and indeed also the slowness of the APEC forum. So I think this goal hasn't disappeared, and indeed, if anything, just because the U.S. is now no longer a member of the TPP, it doesn't mean that the goal of trans-Pacific trade therefore should be dumped. So I think it's important for it to continue. But the question then is that the TPP 11 that remains has to pick up the pieces. It has to move on. It has to continue to progress, and it's not going to be easy, in large part because the U.S. The U.S. participation within the TPP would have accounted for, depending on who you read, 70 to 80% of trade share within the TPP. But that being said, I'm very pleased to see countries like Australia and Japan taking the lead now to try to revive the TPP 11. And in Japan's case, despite the Japanese reservations in the initial aftermath of Mr. Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. from the TPP. So it is very good to see the Australians and the Japanese, and I think others as well, coming on board to make sure that the TPP can continue, and of course keeping the door open to the United States should it decide to one day in the foreseeable future rejoin, perhaps, if not the TPP, then maybe some other tweaked version of the TPP. So I think the TPP, therefore, I think should continue. That's a very good question. Mr. Trump strikes me as a person given to a transactional disposition to foreign policy, which is to say that Mr. Trump is presumably looking for quid pro quos. He's looking for opportunities where he can obtain some form of reciprocity from partners and from interlocutors. So I do not think he is a person, therefore, given to insisting on perhaps an ideological disposition to international affairs. So it would seem to me that Mr. Trump, being the businessman that he is, being the hopefully pragmatic person that he has claimed to be as well, that when the moment is right, when the conditions are appropriate, that the United States would conceivably return to the fold, as it were. But I think really it boils down, therefore, to the prospective negotiations that Mr. Trump would presumably have with his other interlocutors, and whether those conditions are therefore appropriate, in his view, for the United States to return to the discussions, to the table. I think that is where the difficulty lies. As the saying goes, the devil is in the details, and presumably that is where the complications could emerge. But so long as Mr. Trump and hopefully the other partners also all keep an open mind to the possibility for further discussions down the road, and that the door therefore is not completely shut, then I think the region stands a pretty decent chance of some kind of progress downstream. My sense is that the fundamentals are inherently sound, and countries have in my view, unfortunately, very aggressively pursued wealth policies with very little care and concern for what I would call the other important things, equally important things, such as distributive justice. That is to say, the making distribution of wealth much more equitable. I think that is a very important thing, and which helps to balance some of the neoliberal excesses of the system. The case in point is we saw the greed and the avarice and recklessness of the banks and all the brokerages that when left unchecked, it really created a lot of problems leading to the global financial crisis of 2008 and what have you. So I think my sense is it goes well beyond just mere checks and balances. And when you think about it, income inequality is hollowing out. It's shrinking the middle class in the West, in the U.S. and in Europe as well. And it is certainly widening the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And it is this kind of a thing that has led to Brexit. It is this kind of thing that led to Mr. Trump's victory in the U.S. Elections. And therefore, I think globalization and liberalism, if it has a future, it must therefore embrace some form of distributive justice, be very conscious about it, work hard to protect it, work hard to preserve it. Well, my sense is that it is still very difficult to say whether liberalism is already in crisis mode. I think the jury is still out on that. I think what would be very bad, what would be detrimental is that if other countries would retaliate against the United States, should the U.S. engage in some measure of protectionist policy. And it is in fact this very thing, this very fact that would serve as the basis for the U.S. potentially precipitating a trade war. But even that being said, my sense is that even if you have this kind of a tit-for-tat behavior, it could be a short-term kind of an event. But that being said, I think what is much more fundamental, the more challenging risk, is that if countries were to reject global norms, if countries were to repudiate global norms and institutions that underpin the liberal globalized economy, that end up essentially rejecting the global economic order. And this will happen if countries believe, for whatever reason, that the United States is no longer committed to the economic order as it stands today and is no longer committed to shouldering the burdens of the global economic order. So I think when that happens, but I don't think we're there yet, but when that happens, I think liberalism would be in big trouble. That's a very, very interesting and difficult question. My sense is if one were to look at the long cycles, certainly in U.S. history, if not world history, one sees the pendulum shifts in terms of ideological responses. But that being said, the sorts of populism and protectionism that we see today seem to be not particularly corresponding to any specific ideological stance, or at least traditional ideological position. That is presumably the worrying thing, it would seem to me. But that being said, I think one could hope perhaps that the lesson of history would teach us that these things do swing back and forth. And what will be important is for, again, a combination of national leadership as well as the corporate sectors, the civil society working together to present, hopefully, collectively the message that these trajectories, populist trajectories, protectionist, mercantilist, isolationist, that these kinds of things are at the end of the day inimical to the well-being of global order. What needs to happen, I think, is some kind of a balance and a commitment, therefore, to ensuring that as I said earlier, things like some form of distributive justice has to be in place in order to keep that stability and balance. Well, I would like to think that Mr. Macron's victory in France, Mr. Macron, of course, is a pro-EU centrist. It would seem to me that suggests that the EU will not collapse just yet, in part because the French-German axis is so important to the well-being and stability of the EU. But the EU's future, it seems to me, could well depend on how well negotiations over Brexit go. What I mean by that is that, and An orderly and cooperative Brexit is not a given, unfortunately. And the outcome of Brexit negotiations will determine whether the future of EU-UK relationship, whether that relationship will be a positive one, whether it will be a constructive one. So I think we need to keep an eye on how well those negotiations proceed. I think intuitively one would assume that if China were to lead the Asia-Pacific region, that a China-led Asia-Pacific would look somewhat different than a US-led one. But the issue is not just about new emerging powers sort of redefining the rules of the game. Because if one were to see what's happening today, it is Mr. Trump, the United States today, that is presenting the world with a revisionist agenda, and for a more populist, more protectionist, at least, presumably a more self-centered America. Whereas it is President Xi Jinping on the other side who is championing globalization, defending globalization, as he did at Davos in January of this year. So all that to say that it is by no means a given that established powers would automatically preserve the status quo, whereas rising powers, emerging powers are the ones that are more revisionist in nature. Because looking at America and China today, at least rhetorically, it seems as if the tables have been turned. I think two things come to my mind. The first of which is that it is the dissatisfaction of the people with their personal economic circumstances. It is these things that drive people to support populist and protectionist causes. And there are inherent problems like housing crisis, limited access to education, and things of this sort that highlight the sorts of policy failures that need to be addressed at the domestic levels. The second issue is that there is a worrying trend, it seems to me, of as I mentioned earlier, mainstream politicians, national leaders, sounding very populist themselves in their reactions to populist trends and protectionist trends. So again, going back to the point I made earlier, it seems to me that national leaders would have to make a concerted effort, commitment to ensuring that they themselves do not end up sounding like their opponents. The temptation is there because when you face a disaffected populace, when you face voters that are pushing you to take a particular stance, championing globalization, championing liberalism would be very unpopular in that regard. But it seems to me that there needs to be some level of nonetheless, of commitment to protecting these sorts of values that will ensure that the world does not go off in a direction that is isolationist and becomes problematic unto itself. Well, I think we have already touched on many of these issues, and I guess, as I said earlier, there needs to be a concerted response and rejoinder to a post-Trump, post-Brexit world and this is a role that, as I've proposed earlier, that East Asia can play. That we need to provide a collective, concerted response that will ensure that the values of globalization, the values of a liberal economic order are preserved and maintained. Again, I don't want to brush off the difficulties that kind of a system has posed to the world, which has led, therefore, to Mr. Trump's emergence and what have you. I think there are some very, very serious issues that need to be addressed, very serious deficits that need to be addressed, things such as distributive justice and what have you. But it seems to me that what East Asia can offer in response is not just to argue on behalf of globalization, not just to argue on behalf of liberalism, but to make the message that there needs to be all these other considerations. A case in point would be the role that South Korea played when South Korea chaired the G20 some years ago. Where I think South Korea did a very important job of arguing on behalf of the importance of sustainable development before the G20. And so I think it is this kind of a role that East Asia can play as a whole in providing a rational and reasonable response that hopefully would encourage the rest of the world not to bring us to the brink of this sort of the kinds of much more potentially ugly things that a very extremely protectionist, extremely populist world will indeed lead us toward. I am not quite sure what to expect downstream, but I would certainly hope, as I've been arguing, that East Asia can certainly provide that sort of reasonable, rational response, and that, as I've said earlier, East Asia has, for the duration of the post-Cold War period, been a very robust advocate for open regionalism, for a brand of regionalism that is not exclusive to East Asia, but one that in fact champions and the sorts of norms and values and principles that underpin the globalized economy. East Asia is the prime example of a region that has maintained and enhanced those connections with the world at large. Of course, it has opened the region up to other kinds of problems. When the global financial crisis struck, because of East Asia's openness, some countries, some economies in our part of the world suffered as a result. But I think it is that kind of a robust commitment and investment in ensuring that regionalism ends up shoring up and providing the sorts of building blocks and stepping stones to a world that's interconnected, and a world that hopefully through trade linkages, investment linkages, will be able to maintain a shared prosperity for one and all. I think that is the role, that is the kind of regionalism that I would like to see East Asia play, and hope to see East Asia play down the road. I just want to wish everyone a very good Jeju Forum, a very prosperous Jeju Forum, and may we see better things to come down the road for the world.